And so the G20 leadership cycle has shifted from four emerging economies, culminating with South Africa, to the United States, raising questions about the future of debt relief. Now, this transition occurs as debt across emerging economies hits a record $100 trillion, with the International Monetary Fund identifying 20 African nations as high risk of distress. Now, former South African Finance Minister Trevor Manuel stressed the need for solutions and not just tinkering around the box. Now, the group's resolve is being tested by severe crises like the one in Senegal, where billions in undisclosed borrowing froze an IMF program and triggered a sharp ratings downgrade. The U.S. presidency faces immediate pressure to actually deliver tangible action and overcome the slow pace of current debt relief mechanisms. That's if attentions do not shift anyway. But at this time, I'm joined by Gabriel Crouse, a fellow at the Institute of Race Relations, and he will be sharing his thoughts with us on the show. Thank you so much, Gabriel, for joining us on Business Edge.
Glad to be here. Greetings.
Yeah, so with debt across emerging economies surpassing $100 trillion due to post-pandemic spending, higher borrowing costs as we've seen, and slow growth, what practical global solutions actually exist to reduce this burden?
I suppose you can break down the answer to that question into two parts. On the one side, you can look at the lenders, and on the other side, you can look at the borrowers. So from the lender's perspective, there might be debt restructuring. And that's when lenders say, okay, we agreed we would lend you this money. We agreed we would do it with this interest rate. We agreed you would pay it back in this amount of time. But we see now that if we keep asking you or insisting that you stick to that deal, it's actually going to do more harm than good. It's going to drive you to a point where you can't pay us back at all. And so we'll rather agree to reduce the amount that you pay us back and extend the time so that we have something that works for both parties. The alternative side to look at is the borrowers. And borrowers can do a range of things when they're countries to put themselves in a better position to pay back debt. Generally speaking, what they can do is, stop wasting money and increase taxes or decrease expenditure on non-productive government programs. And I think that if you look at the current debt situation, particularly in emerging markets in Africa, it seems to me like overall there's going to be a little bit of both, at least something from both of those sides. In some cases is going to be necessary in order to go forward effectively.
You talk about financial prudency and cutting of financial waste. But then, as it concerns Africa, do you actually think that Africa can stop borrowing?
I don't think Africa can stop borrowing, but I don't think any country can stop borrowing. I think that if you look at global trends amongst rich countries and countries that are poor, but getting rich quickly, borrowing is a part of the mix for both. There's a lot of debt in America, which is the richest country in the world. Its debt levels have doubled in the last 5 or 6 years, and doubled before that in the last decade, and doubled before that in the last 20 years. So they're not only borrowing, they're borrowing at increasingly fast rates. At a certain point, that does become unsustainable. But part of the reason they borrow is because when you borrow at a low interest rate, then what you effectively do is you allow more investment to take place now. I think that the key challenge for Africa is, or for countries within Africa, is not to stop borrowing. Borrowing is good. It's to borrow at a lower interest rate, because when the interest rate is lower, then it is easier for that borrowed money to have a return on investment that is greater than the interest rate. And then you've got a positive business decision or a positive value add decision. In Africa at the moment, it's quite hard to do that because whereas, sovereign debt in America can easily be 2%, in Africa, it can easily be 12 or 20% interest that you have to effectively pay back. And then it's quite hard to use that money to build projects that will actually justify it. Yeah, so stick to borrowing, but bring down the interest rate. That's the goal. And the way to do that is in part through fiscal prudence and a range of things that make lenders feel more comfortable in handing over that money.
All right. So then, Gabriel, given the G20 speakers warned cosmetic fixes, that it will not actually solve sovereign debt problems. Now, considering the conversations that went down during the weekend there, do their proposals genuinely address the pressures faced by middle-income countries too?
I think that they point to cosmetic solutions, and then I think they offer some cosmetic solutions themselves. That's not to say that the G20 has been totally without substance. The Credit Forum has done some good work, but it's mainly helping through sort of facilitation with real lender-borrower relations, bilateral relations. And I wish that they had instead drawn attention to good situations. In Africa, it's important to look at where has it worked and how do we learn from that? And there are a couple of examples. So, one is the Gambia, where there has been some debt restructuring and there has been some fiscal prudence, and that has successfully brought down their debt to GDP ratio from over 100%, like 120%, down under to 75%. And if you're bringing down that ratio of how much you've borrowed to your GDP, that means when you borrow next time, you can borrow much more cheaply because it'll seem more secure, the interest rate will come down. That makes that borrowing much more productive. A similar story can be told about Sierra Leone, where inflation has come down dramatically over the last few years, partly through some debt restructuring and largely through fiscal monetary prudence. And that's been hard for that country to sustain, but it is now in a position to bear the fruits of that. So I think that, the G20 has looked to Chad and Ethiopia and countries where it's facilitated some important deals. Often the IMF is the real backer that's stepping in to offer cheaper credit. Okay. But the overall picture is that, there's some countries, you mentioned Senegal, that has just, had a ratings downgrade. There are these cautionary tales. Oh, look, here it's gone wrong. And look how now they're going to suffer because there's extra interest rates. But there's also good countries that are following a sustainable path to inclusive growth. And I think the G20 needs to do a little bit of work at looking at those good countries and saying, how can we learn from their success and spread that further across the continent?
Okay, so yes, that will be our next conversation because, of course, we need to look at the fact that will these solutions being placed on the table can be transitioned not only from South Africa, even as we see that US will be taken over, will they be able to take up those initiatives and follow through with what needs to be done to reduce Africa's debt portfolio? But Gabriel, I'd like you to just stay with us for a while, all right? We need to quickly go on a short break, and when we return, we'll pick the conversation from there. Just stay with us. So on Business Edge, we've been looking at the just concluded G20 summit in South Africa, Johannesburg precisely, and how emerging markets, including Africa, will be resolving their debt crisis, as we've seen conversations focus on so many areas to actually deal with these markets, of course, debts. And I've been talking to Gabriel Crouse, who is a fellow at the Institute of Race Relations, and he's been sharing his thoughts with us. Gabriel, thank you so much for being there. So this year's summit emphasized Africa's debt relief and financing. Now, we've seen the baton being passed from South Africa to the US. Will this agenda be sustained next year or probably risk being deprioritized?
I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball. I can't see into the future, but it's not looking great. I think one thing people should know, and I'm a South African, I'm proud of my country. I don't enjoy saying this, but South Africa has had the chair position of the G20 for a year and done a lot of talking about African debt. But just to clarify again, the G20's role, it doesn't do debt forgiveness. It just helps negotiate debt restructuring plans between borrower countries and lenders like the IMF. And in the time that Africa was the chair, it's hard to point to new debt restructuring deals that were actually successfully negotiated in ways that translated into, okay, the deal's done and now here's the restructuring. The Zambia and the Ghana deals that the G20 had facilitated were already done before South Africa took over. So a lot of what South Africa did was a cheerleader saying this is a good idea, but it didn't actually get it done. So that's not great for South Africa's role as the chair. I think it means Ramaphosa and his administration, President Ramaphosa, deserves some criticism for talking a lot, but not actually delivering. Now with the US coming in, they didn't even show up to the G20 summit. They're very cross with South Africa for other reasons. And I don't know how much appetite the US has right now for helping highly indebted African countries. The Trump administration's America First policy very much is geared towards, helping his own country, and he's not on the face of it that keen on helping other countries unless it's also going to make America money. Now, obviously, what I was trying to say in the beginning is good debt restructuring will actually help the borrower and the lender because it's a win-win scenario. So, maybe some American foreign policy administrators are going to get their teeth sunk into this, but it is also possible that it's going to go from South Africa cheerleading the issue without delivering to America not even cheering the issue, particularly in its year of chairmanship, and also not delivering. That puts the countries that are currently going into trouble, like Senegal, in a precarious place because they don't have an obvious corner for help coming out of this particular international structure. They might have to look elsewhere to see if they can weather the storm.
So it's quite interesting, Gabriel, that the G20 does not really have legal authority over creditors and private lenders, probably just an advisory role, even as these conversations have gone on. But then doesn't that mean that they would actually lack the capacity to see through with the implementation of debt solutions that solves these crises?
Yeah, the G20 is really, it's a club. What they can bring is a bit of peer pressure, but not much more than that. And I think it's one of the reasons that it was quite surprising when they did manage to facilitate some negotiations in an effective way a few years ago. And if they built on that momentum actively and with real practical effect, I think they could have achieved very interesting things. Sometimes you don't need legal authority to achieve very powerful things. You can do it through reputation management, but that means working quite hard, and that hasn't really played out.
Okay, so considering weak macroeconomic indicators across Africa, some people are saying that the actual goal should be outright debt cancellation. I know you talked about debt reduction in some cases for the restructuring talks and all, but then some people are saying that why not cancel the debts if we can have some strong measures to actually ensure a sustainable debt payment?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think in some cases there should be at least debt haircuts where you don't cancel the whole debt, but you cancel quite a chunk of it. There are particular regions, especially regions that have had civil wars or international conflicts with their neighbors, regions that have been sunk into, political violence by highly contested elections. There are situations where the sense in which the ordinary person in that country should be paying their taxes to go to paying that debt because they are co-responsible for it. It doesn't really make sense because it's like that debt was taken on before the conflict, and now the people after the conflict who are running the country are quite different. We can get into those particular cases where you should have proper debt cuts and debt haircuts or full cancellations. But I also want to say that it has been tried in Africa since the 90s. I mean, sometimes since post-colonialism in the 60s. But in the beginning, post-colonial Africa had to pay back the debts. And then came a sweep of occasions where there were debt cancellations. And often it had a very surprising, counterproductive, perverse outcome, which was the people in charge at the time that the cancellation goes through, then suddenly feel like they can borrow money for nothing. And it is a little bit like a drug that those in power can get addicted to. Then they think, well, now we have the opportunity to borrow a lot more money to go and do whatever we feel like doing. And they lack the discipline of knowing you're going to have to borrow the money to pay for something that really works, because you're going to have to pay this back. Instead, it's like, well, you've got some free money. You can do whatever you want. And that has, on numerous occasions, led to perverse outcomes. And there are a number of international studies by economists who really, I think, have good credentials of showing that they have a sincere concern for Africa, for emerging markets, for sort of getting over the colonial legacy, and yet have found, just on the numbers, that outright debt cancellation, more often than not, leads to negative outcomes 10 years later. It's a little bit like those studies that show if you win the lottery, actually more often than not, 10 years later, people are quite depressed because they spend all of that money immediately, and then friends and family think they still have more to come, but they don't have it. And so they lose their stable equilibrium. I'm not saying that it should never happen. It absolutely should happen in some cases, that there is full debt restructuring where parts of those loans are forgiven. I'm just saying it's got to be done on a very careful case-by-case basis. Otherwise, the medicine ends up becoming a drug that the patient gets addicted to.
Well, even as we're seeing talks around debt restructuring, some sort of financing, investment financing, and greater transparency, we hope that as this involves the IMF, the World Bank, the G20, the creditors, the lenders, and of course the borrowers, there'll be some sort of improved outlook for Africa's debt page, probably in the coming months or years thereabout. Thank you so much, Gabriel Crouse, a fellow at the Institute of Race Relations, for sharing your thoughts with us on the show.